All right, welcome back to another episode of the Agendas podcast. I'm excited to be back here with Ben. Ben, what's going on?
I'm here, yo. Let's get an NBA draft today. I'm ready to go.
Yeah, we're getting into it. The draft is this Thursday, so it's kind of right on time. The podcast will drop, I guess, Tuesday at this point, probably, if not Wednesday, sometime before the draft. But yeah, we have exciting stuff to get into. We have our resident Hawks fan here, Ben, to talk about some Atlanta Hawks with a number one overall pick. I think the number one overall pick is definitely the most interesting point in this draft. I mean, some drafts, like the Zion draft, it's like, okay, the Pelicans are going to take Zion. That's it. Like, there's no discussion really. Obviously, you can create some storylines, this or that, but how good is Zion going to be, stuff like that. But with this draft being not such a lock at number one because of the talent at the top. I think it makes things more interesting with who the Hawks are going to take. Could they potentially trade out? Is there a trade for a player that makes sense? All that type of stuff. We're going to get into some of that, and then we'll talk about some other teams at the top. I think the Spurs are interesting. The Wizards just because they're number two overall. So we'll get into something like that. But let's start with the Hawks, who have the number one overall pick, and the Hawks are an interesting situation because a lot of times the number one overall pick goes to a team that's trash, right? For example, like the Wizards at number two. That team is just like starting over, rebuilding. They need everything, so they're just taking the highest potential talent player in the draft, and that's it. Calling it a day. That player's going to get 500 shots a game. But the Hawks are, a little bit more interesting. Not that they're a contender, but last year they were in the play-in after Trae Young got hurt for a decent amount of the season. So, they're probably somewhere last year in the 6 to 10 seed range in terms of everyone was healthy the whole season, which is it's not a great team, but it's for a number one overall pick. It's very good, and they're also an interesting spot in terms of the Trae Young DeJounte Murray pairing, where a lot of people have talked about the potential of them splitting up. Will the Hawks trade one of them, trade both of them? So this is kind of like a turning point for the Hawk, an inflection point where they kind of have to make a decision about what they're going to be. The past couple of years they kind of just have been sitting there in that like mediocre range ever since the conference finals and haven't really been forced to make a decision one way or the other in terms of direction of the franchise. And I think them getting the number one overall pick kind of forces them to say, okay, this is what we're going to be going forward. We're going to trade this guy and we're going to take this guy number one. And, that's what we're going to be. Kind of sets you up for the future. So it kind of forces their front office to make some real decisions. Ben, what are your overall thoughts on just the Hawks having the number one overall pick before we get into the specifics of which player trades, things like that, like in terms of where the Hawks are as a franchise and what this number one overall pick means for them?
Right. I mean, yeah, you kind of touched on it. The Hawks, like they're not a clean slate. They have players. I want to get. I mean, at some point, maybe whatever. I don't have to do this right now, but to get into a little bit of their roster construction when we're getting into specific players and how they're going to fit in, like you were saying, they kind of have to pick a plan. Um, I'm not sure that this number one pick is going to cause them to do that. But whatever. When we get into the players, specific players, we'll kind of talk about, a little bit of their roster construction. But to me, the way I look at it is what's weighing over your head is Trae Young being on relatively thin ice. I'm not saying it's thin, but it's getting there. And to me, he is your championship window. Um, Nobody in this draft is that level of player, even in their 100th percentile outcome, I don't think. Or maybe it is, but that's like a 1% chance they reach the 100th percentile outcome. Plus, you don't have control over your picks for the next 3 years. So no Cooper Flag, no Ace Bailey, and the 2 years after that, you're also not unless you trade one of these guys to the Spurs or trade the pick to the Spurs for some of that capital back. That's a different conversation. But to me, the issue with the Hawks is they need to win enough this year to keep Trae Young on the team, and I don't. The path to do that is tough and specific.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I think the main thing for the Hawks is obviously this is a very pro Trae Young podcast. I think he gets disrespected way too much in terms of where people rank him and stuff like that. I just saw Bill Simmons had Kyrie Irving over Trae Young. That's an
Oh my
absolute
God.
joke. Yeah,
Oh my
that's
God. I
insane.
mean, this is
But
a
but
very this is
go ahead.
this is probably the most safe space for Trae Young on the planet. I am a very pro Trae Young human being here.
Yeah, I'm very pro Trae Young, as well. But again, having him next to Kyrie Irving is probably the common take now because people are so close-minded in terms of the player's not winning in title contention right now, so he must not be that good. People were like this with Devin Booker, like, is he just a good stats, bad team guy for the first bit of his career, and he has to prove that he could win. Now, obviously, Trae Young has proven he can win to a
Well,
certain extent, and
people have him with Tyrese Halliburton, where their run was just a complete fluke, and we'll see what happens. As opposed to guys they have over that, like a Jalen Brunson, who did a very similar thing to the Pacers this season. Or we don't need to get into Luka comparisons. Obviously, Luka's better, but how big that gap is there when you have that surrounding talent? A different conversation in terms of how much help do number one players need, but a different conversation. I'm just saying if Trae Young is in a Tyrese Halliburton conversation, then I'm just leaving the conversation.
yeah, well, I think people have changed their mind about Tyrese Halliburton specifically throughout the series. As he just played worse throughout the second half of the season. But again, honestly, it's not unreasonable for someone to say, well, it's a fluke. He didn't make the conference finals. He made it one year, and then he kind of hasn't done any much since. As a non-Hawks fan, that's what you're going to think. But anyways, we'll get into that um, separately. But I think I want to get into the players. Um, again, like Ben talked about, there's kind of two strategies. If you want to keep Trae Young, then you want to pick a player that's going to help you win, sort of right now, and less of a raw prospect type of player. And there is obviously the potential. It's been thrown around. Maybe they trade DeJounte and Trae Young, which I don't think they're going to do. Right? I think likely they're going to trade one or the other. And in that case, maybe you're more open to the potential of it's going to take a couple of years if you're not concerned about Trae Young asking out for a trade. But let's get into some of the players. I think there's three main potential prospects at the top for the Hawks from all the rumors and all the research that we've done. Um, Number one is Alex Sarr. Now, Alex Sarr. Well, let's list all the players first, and then we can go into one by one. You have Alex Sarr, Donovan Clingan, and then Zachary Risachet. Ben, is there anyone else who would add to that? Like, legitimately, you would not be surprised if the Hawks selected them number one overall on draft night.
So this is mock draft versus big board. I have my personal opinion right now is a different player than those three. Well, Ron Hall, I mean, whatever. There's two other players that I would have. I would, if I was the GM, which I'm not, I would pick one of those two players that you did not list. Um, but
Which
I think
players?
there's a
Which
zero.
players? Throw it out there.
Well, I was going to say there's a 0% chance the Hawks are taking these players. The player I would pick for the Hawks is Reed Shepard. I know about the defense, whatever. We can have a conversation if we want to. This is totally hypothetical. They're not doing it. That's who I would pick. And then Ron Holland is the other guy.
Yeah, okay. Those names have definitely been thrown around. Again, this is a pretty wide open draft. So in terms of like if someone else had the number one overall pick, I think there's potential that those two guys would be in the conversation. But just from like the Hawks' perspective, it seems like it's Klingon, Sarr, and Ricochet. Obviously, whatever. We can get into Reed Shepard here in a bit, but let's start with Alex Sarr, right? Because it's probably the most talked about. And there's been some reports in the past week that he is not interested in going to the Hawks. He has not given them a private workout. And it seems like from his agency that he wants to go to Washington. Now, why would you want to go to Washington over the Hawks? There's one simple reason, and that's you want to get unlimited shots, unlimited opportunities, without having to be criticized or anything like that, right? You're in Washington, you're pretty much in nowhere, and you just get 2 or 3 years of you're the guy, take as many shots as you want, handle the ball as much as you want, develop as much as you want, which could be a positive thing for him. If he goes to the Hawks, they're trying to win to some degree, right? So he's not just going to be a free for all; he's going to be a cog in the system, which I think will be very good for him next to Trae Young because Trae Young has made every single big man better, specifically, right? But again, if he just wants, I want to touch the ball as much as I want, I want to play as much as I want, and things like that. I want to run the team basically. Then it makes sense that his agency would start pushing him towards Washington. Now, as a fit on the Hawks, it's kind of debatable. I think he's what is he 7'2", Ben 7'1"?
Something like that. I mean, ridiculous. He's tall.
Yeah, he's 7'1", but again, he's not like that big man like Donovan Clingan. We'll get into in a minute. He's not like a center who's going to set fat screens and run the pick and roll and catch lobs and stuff like that. On offense, that's not really his role. I'll let Ben get into more detail in a second, but he's kind of in between that 4-5. So it's an interesting thing with the Hawks because at the 4 they have Jalen Johnson, right? So that's kind of their set 4 of the future, as it should be. His potential is off the charts, and he's been really good. And specifically last year, he took a big jump. And then if he's not going to be that center, right, where they kind of have Capella and Okongwu, like, is he going to be that center? And if he is going to be that center, between him and Jalen Johnson, if both of them can't really shoot, especially at this point in the career, it could be a tough fit. So that's where it gets interesting. But why don't you, Ben, get into more of how Alex Sarr potentially could fit within the Hawks?
Right. So, I mean, I'm staying away from Alex Sarr, especially in general, but especially as the Hawks. Maybe the Wizards, who have a blank slate and an unlimited timeline, it's worth a shot. As the Hawks, for sure, I would stay away from him. I want to drop this comp because just because I'm excited about it. I view him as Isaiah Simmons of the Arizona Cardinals in the NFL. They drafted that guy. He was like a safety cornerback. He can play this position and that position, and he can do this and that. The problem is he's not actually elite at anything. He doesn't have like if you're a safety, you need three elite traits, and if you're a corner, you need three different elite traits, and if you're a pass rusher, you need three different elite traits. And he has like one trait of each that he's very good at, but it doesn't actually add up to being anything. And so if he hits like his 80th percentile outcome and he can shoot and it's like, okay, great. Doesn't really matter if he can't rebound because we'll just put him at the four. Or if if he can't shoot but he gets stronger, so then you can put him at the five. But I think specifically for the hot, like, so there's if he hits his 80th percentile outcome where he can do both those things, so you put him at the five and he's a star. The problem for the Hawks is that he's going to stink for the first 2 years, or at least the first year, and then by the time he reaches that in 3+ years, Trae Young's gone, and then basically I just don't care anymore. Like that's how much I value Trae Young. Um, and while Alex Sarr is a great player with his 80th percentile, that's not moving your franchise by itself. That's like a third play. Even that's like a third player, like a Kristaps Porzingis on steroids. Like is like the ceiling. Like that's not even a second player on a championship team. But specifically to tie back into the Hawks, yeah, Jalen Johnson is a four. In theory, he could play the three, but let's have people play their primary positions, as I'll kind of get into with all these prospects. He's a four. Capella and Okongwu, you have two fives. Let's say you bring in Sarr, you trade one of those guys. So Sarr's your five. The problem is he's not a good five right now. So right now, in year one, he needs to play the four, which is not going to work because he can't shoot, and your five probably can't shoot. So that's just a problem in and of itself. But besides for that, with the Hawks specifically, he needs to play the four in year one and probably year two. But Jalen Johnson's the four. So how's he ever getting any minutes? Because he's not a good five, and he needs to play the four, but we already have a four. Plus, he doesn't really work today as a four because he can't shoot, and he doesn't work as a five. It's like it does not fit with the Hawks.
Yeah, I agree with you. He's too skinny from what it seems like to play the five, and he's not a good enough rebounder. Now, if I'm taking Alex Sarr, my hope is he's putting on 20 to 30 pounds of muscle and he's going to get much bigger. If you look at younger pictures of Giannis or Embiid or players like that, not that he's going to be that, not that he's going to be that, but just the body types. And when they gain 30 pounds of muscle, obviously, it can help in the rebounding department and he can maybe become that legitimate five. But yeah, for the Hawks, like if he can't shoot, right, and he can't be a five, so like where does he fit? Now, if you put him on a team like the Wizards, then it's kind of just like who cares because it's the Wizards and everything's available. So that's where it becomes potentially interesting. But in terms of the Hawks, it doesn't seem to make a ton of sense unless they're just like, this is the player with the highest potential and we don't care and we're going to take him and we'll figure it out later. So there's always that possibility. But then let's move on to the next one, which is Klingon, who seems like a much cleaner fit. A pretty stereotypical center, very big, good rebounder, sets good hard screens, can defend, obviously rim protector. People say that's probably the safest attribute about him, where he's just going to be a plus rim protector. Like they don't see a scenario where he's not going to be if you listen to like the draft experts. So next to Trae Young, especially with Clint Capella getting older, I know Ben likes the idea of Clint Capella mentoring him, right? But as Clint Capella gets older, to kind of have that big man next to Trae Young, where Trae Young is going to obviously lack something defensively, and he can be that rock behind him to kind of clean up the mess, get those rebounds, set those hard screens, to be a good pick and roll partner with Trae Young for the future. It seems like probably the cleanest fit and maybe the best player from day one. So Ben, how do you think a Klingon would fit with the Hawks?
Klingon fits well. I think Ricochet is the best just fit. But we'll get into Ricochet. But Klingon's also a good fit. It would be very clean. It would be Trae Young, Jalen Johnson, Capella as your 1, 4, and 5. And then you have Hunter at the backup 4. Right now, you have no threes on the roster, and DeJounte's probably getting traded. So you need to, if you draft Klingon, you have Trae Young, Jalen Johnson, and Klingon as your building blocks. Each one has a position. They work together. A little bit limited shooting. Jalen Johnson's not a non-shooter. He's like 33, 34%. Like he's not great, but he's not a non-shooter. Um, So hopefully Jalen Johnson develops shooting, whatever. I mean, that's a problem with any center. But you have three building blocks for the future, each with positions that fit together. In my opinion, you would trade a Kongwu because I think Clint works really well as training Klingon. You know, as like they're a very similar player. So, and Klingon has, I mean, and Capella has all that experience. He can train Klingon, and their timelines are perfect, right? Klingon's going to come into the league. He can't play full minutes. That's been a knock on him. So he'll be backup or starting limited minutes, whatever. And then as Capella falls off and Klingon gets better, that'll like overlap and switch perfectly where Capella becomes your backup five and Klingon's your starting five, and they play the same way. It fits really well together. Plus in that scenario, you trade a Kongru and you trade DeJounte, and you need to come back with a starting two and a starting three. One of those guys hopefully can be a point of attack defender, and both of them need to be able to shoot. But it's a pretty simple fit, and it's a very doable fit in one off season, and they'll be competitive next season.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you saw my Twitter, but that's where I threw out the DeJounte for Ingram trade, which has been around. Then you swap Ingram for a three, which could be a potentially clean fit. And it's kind of interesting how we're talking so much about fit for the number one overall pick. Usually, just like you take the best player and call it a day. But that's where it is interesting with the Hawks. That's where the Hawks are at this point in their career. So, and not in their career, in their franchise.
But
So
also these players. I mean, whatever you talked about this, and I think that was a really great point you mentioned to me offline. Was like all these players need to develop traits, and we're like, oh, this guy needs to do this and this, and we're like guessing. We have no idea. So just take the player who, in theory, would be the highest upside, as long as the traits he needs to develop are relatively reasonable, and just go with that. Um, but that's a long way away. And for the Hawks, if they're going to do it, they would have to do a total rebuild to do that. And these players are risky, right? Alex Sarr has a 0.72% chance, like 0 point, like less than 1% that he becomes Giannis in 5 years. Is that worth the chance? Like you're losing Trae Young if you draft him, in my opinion, sometime in the next year or two. Is it worth the 1% chance that he becomes Giannis? Like to me, that seems a little ridiculous.
no, yeah, 100%. That's like a team like the Wizards is taking that shot because they have nothing now. So let's take that 1% shot because what else
And
are
they
we
have
gonna
nothing to
do, right?
lose. There's no star player that's going away because you're developing a guy. He's going to be good, and he's going to be good, and maybe he becomes elite, but they're not losing anything to develop him.
100%. And the Klingon thing, yeah, it seems like a clean fit. The only thing is, you hope Jalen Johnson gets better at that shooting. If he can get to 37, 38%, it's a lot cleaner fit with Klingon, who's probably going to be a non-shooter in his career. That's just is what it is. But let's move on to the next prospect I talked about. Is that Zachary Ricochet, as we call him, Worcestershire sauce. All right, that's how he's known on this podcast. The more I hear about him, kind of seems like a jack of all trades, and he's like plus at like none of them. It's like, oh, he's 6'10", and he can kind of shoot, but we're not that confident he can shoot, and he can kind of defend, but he kind of sucks at help defense, and he can't really play make, and he can't create his own shot, right? So it's like, okay, but people do like him, right? It's he's a Europe, he's French, right? Isn't he French?
Yes, sir.
So he's a French player. He is 6'10", right? Um, he can't shoot. He's been shooting. I think it's a little bit streaky, but it potentially will be a clean fit for the Hawks just because you put him at that three, a guy who can potentially shoot the ball, at least hold his own defensively somewhat, especially point of attack. And kind of fit as like a role player. It's kind of taking like a role player number one, which is interesting. I think I like his fit with the Spurs, which we can get into later. But yeah, in terms of a Hawk, it's also a clean fit where you just slide him into the three, right? Then you have potentially Trey, Bogey, Ricochet, Jalen Johnson, Capella, or Okongwu, whatever it is, something like that, right? And it's just another like good, solid player to add to your rotation. But again, it's like when you take that at number one, it's a little disappointing, even in this draft, in my opinion. So I'm kind of out on it. But what do you think in terms of his fit with the Hawks?
Yeah, I mean, I think you touched on the points where there's no. He's a role player, and the shooting is good, but it's nothing special. It's good shooting, and there's some off ball, there's some like movement shooting. That's probably the most like quote unquote special thing about it. But on that, he's just like a 39% shooter, which is good, but it's not anything crazy. It's not Michael Porter Jr. Um, but I think the fit for for the Hawks, the fit is literally perfect. One of the Hawks' two biggest problems: point of attack defense, and they have no threes on the roster. This guy's a three who's going to guard 3, 2, and 1. And obviously, you're only taking number one overall if your scouts believe this guy's an elite defender, hopefully. So it just literally plugs in perfectly. You literally have to do nothing. Honestly, maybe keep DeJounte on the roster. Just run it with those like the five you have, and it fits. Hunter's now a backup, which is great. Well, I don't know if Reese is starting, year one, but it just literally fits the Hawks exactly perfectly. It will work with Trae Young, who's an elite passer, and he will create shots for this guy, and this guy's a shooter. Like it just fits like literally perfectly, but just like at number one overall, it seems a little bit out of control.
Yeah, if the Hawks want to be as conservative as possible this offseason, despite all the rumors, and just be like, yeah, let's run it back and add a piece, like this is the guy to do it. But again, it is a little disappointing at number one. But I think it could be a potentially interesting fit for some other teams. Um, but let's it's prediction time, Ben. I want to get your prediction on who do you think when Adam Silver goes up to the podium on Thursday night, who the Atlanta Hawks select who? Who are they taking?
Donovan Clingan.
Going to Klingon. I think I agree with you. I think they end up taking Klingon. Now, I have seen it thrown around that they take Sarr to kind of like hold him hostage from the Wizards because they know the Wizards want him, and then force the Wizards to give because the Wizards have a second first round pick and force them to do that. I wouldn't play games like that, right? Because you don't know who the Wizards are going to take, right?
I've heard that with the Spurs also, where they're like, take Ricochet to make, because that's who the Spurs maybe want, and then hope the Spurs trade you for Ricochet. It's like, uh-oh, you might end up with Ricochet. That would be a disaster.
I mean, I don't think Ricochet would be a disaster, but yeah. But I think if the Spurs want Ricochet, let's get into some of the Spurs talk because the Spurs are number four. I think that's
I want
probably
to
the
get into
second
Reed
most.
Shepard at some point, but it'll fit into the Spurs. It'll fit into the Spurs.
Yeah, we'll talk some Spurs. I think they're the second most interesting team in the draft. They have the fourth pick in the draft, the eighth pick in the draft. They were awful last year, but they had a great Wemby year. If you told me going to this year that's what Wemby would have been, I think he exceeded expectations despite the hype. I mean, he's everything you thought he could be and more. Just a monster defensively. Could have won Defensive Player of the Year as a rookie, and his offensive game looked a lot more polished than I've heard some people talking about before the draft. But they're in a position where they need to add talent, right? And they have the fourth pick and the eighth pick, and it is a weaker draft. But they do have some players that could potentially be a good fit. I think Risa would be interesting, as a 6'10" forward, and then you have Wemby at the five. I mean, oh my gosh, right? That's just insane. I've heard some Sarr things. If they were to trade up to number one and put Sarr next to Wemby, that could be interesting. I mean, I think that's assuming both players can get better at shooting than they are currently. And like Ben talked about, Reese Shepard could be an interesting fit. Although I think Houston at number three is reported to like him, and it could be a good fit there. So if they want Reese Shepard, they might have to trade up with the Hawks or the Wizards, but the Wizards probably don't want to trade down, right? So in terms of Reese Shepard, you're putting a guard next to Wemby, right? Someone who can shoot the lights out. We know that for a fact. He's a little short, but if you're going to have a short guard, Ben, who are you picking as a center besides Victor Wembanyama, right? I mean, it's just a dream fit. Um, and you just need functional people who can handle the ball. That's what the Spurs need. I mean, I don't know what this Popovich fascination with Jeremy Shohan handling the ball, that needs to stop. All right, that was cute for a year if you want to develop Jeremy Shohan, but I'm not developing Jeremy Shohan at the risk of Victor Wembanyama. Okay, so we need functional players that can handle the ball. In terms of a guard prospect, um, you know, the only thing about him is the guy could shoot the lights out, right? So next to Wemby, you add a floor spacer and just again just a functional human being to bring the ball up. But Ben, why don't you talk more about that Reese Shepard fit, or if there's someone you think is if that's on the Spurs board, who should be the number one player on their board if they had the number one pick in the draft?
Reed Shepard. And I think for the Hawks, who don't have a lot of what this do not have Victor Wembanyama, the Hawks should also take him. I would take this guy if I was the Hawks. But for sure for the Spurs, it's a no-brainer. This guy could shoot the lights out. I mean, what else you want? This guy is I mean, people say like since Steph Curry, this guy, I mean, he's not Steph Curry, but since Steph Curry, this guy shot 50%. This guy shot great on contested shots, great on pull-ups. Great. Like this guy is an elite shooter. Elite. Defensively, he's small, but he tries. Like that's all you can care about. Can he play the one? Sure, but really he's a two. There's not really like crazy. I mean, there's some guard prospects like this guy maybe is this and this guy's maybe that, whatever. Kind of like all the other prospects. If I was the Spurs, I would go get a guard. I would get somebody to be a veteran point guard. Like we're not messing around with rookies here. Like somebody young like a Garland. Go get Garland to be the point guard. This guy plays the two with elite shooting, and to me, and Victor Wembanyama, like this level of shooting that this guy has is just an offensive game changer for any team. And the Spurs specifically that can absorb his defensive issues for being small. And This guy also does not need the ball in his hands. He's not a number one guard. So this guy can fit next to those high usage guards that are relatively ish common to. You can get a high usage guard, but sometimes they're hard to play with. Victor Wembanyama and Reed Shepard would be two of the best players you would want to put next to a high usage guard. Like for example, Luka Doncic, who is the top two players I would want to play with him, who would fit with him. Maybe it might be Reed Shepard and Victor Wembanyama. So like that's where I would start my team, and then we can pull in the guard and we can pull in some other defense in at the 3 and the 4 with that as our foundation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm going to question it a little bit more than you are, just because you mentioned Darius Garland. I don't think you'd have Darius Garland at the 1 and Reed Shepard at the 2 because your both guards are under 6'2". That's not going to work in the NBA, especially if you're trying to make a deep playoff run at some point with Wembanyama. What I was thinking is more if you have like a forward, like someone like a Franz Wagner almost, who can bring up the ball and then like get like a bigger guard. I think that's more interesting, where you can kind of slide him next to him, right? Where he's technically the 2, but your 3 is the point guard, and then you have like another guard. You know what I'm saying? Where
Sure,
you have height around him, which why I think it doesn't work with Trae Young. Obviously, you're gonna have elite shooting, and Trae Young is an elite shooter. This people say, what about his numbers? If Reed Shepard took the shots that Trae Young was taking, his shots would go down. Whatever it is, if you put Trae Young up this, I'll just quickly say, if you put Trae Young as a spot up shooter and told him to take wide open threes, the guy's shooting 40+%. Okay, if you're just wrong if you debate that. The thing is, the way he plays, he's not taking those shots, so his percentages aren't going to be down. But Trae Young is an elite shooter. If you question that, debate at all. But him next to Reed Shepard, I just think they're too small in today's NBA. We're seeing two
sure.
backcourts break up. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So to go into the Hawks, right? So the thing with the Spurs and the Hawks is you just put Reed Shepard on the team. They're not winning a championship. It's too small. They're going to get picked on. We saw that. That's maybe one of the biggest lessons from this playoffs is your terrible defenders are going to get exposed. I mean, this is not new, but this was a first playoff run where it really saw it, especially in the finals, um, where your bad defender is just going to get exposed. It was exposed because there was a really bad defender in Luka, and there was a team in the Celtics that is like literally just like a computer, and they're like, we're going to just pick on this guy and spam it. So like it kind of got exposed. So yeah, Reed Shepard and a small guard is not winning you a championship. But both the Spurs and the Hawks don't need to win a championship this year. They need to win. They need to be competitive in a playoff series or two. They need to be out of the play-in. And I think you can do that with him. And then from there, you can adjust and get more tailored players to take you to that next level, to championship level. Um, to bring it back into the Hawks specifically, yeah, it's going to be a problem defensively, but you have Trae Young, Reed Shepard, Jalen Johnson at the 4, Capella at the 5. Like, it fits pretty well. And then you trade, whatever, maybe you keep a Kongwu. But you need to trade DeJounte for a 3, and that 3's got to be a defender, point of attack down. So, like, it's a tight fit. The other thing with the Hawks is if they're trying to win a championship, Trae Young's on a bit of a short leash. Trae Young might not be on the next Hawks really good team. And so I look at it from that perspective. I think Reed Shepard can win enough to potentially keep Trae Young. I look at it from that perspective. And yes, if you want to get to the next level, you're going to have to change it up. But also, there's a chance Trae Young is out pretty soon. And so I view it as a bit of a blank slate where like Jalen Johnson and elite shooting with Reed Shepard at the 2 that fits with a high usage guard, like that's a pretty good, that to me is a much better blank slate than Jalen Johnson and the 10th best center in the league.
Yeah, I mean, if you think Trae Young is leaving next year, we didn't really mention this. Then I'm not taking Klingon, right? Klingon is a bet on Trae Young, right? That's what it is. Um, Now, in terms of Reed Shepard, in terms he hasn't had the playmaking. Again, if you're saying he's a 2, then you need like a
He's a
tall guard
2.
to go with him.
He was
Yeah,
a
he's a
2 in
2.
college.
Right, so you need a tall guard to go with him in today's NBA. But again, what'll be interesting is if the Spurs take him, right, just because they need a functional player and helps them win. I disagree with you on the Spurs. If the Spurs make the play in and lose, that's fine. That's a success for this year. As much as people are like, Wemby has
No,
to win
yeah.
today. Wemby has to be holding the championship next year. No, he doesn't. Relax. Every single NBA player goes through this.
No, I
Look
agree
at
with you.
Michael Jordan.
I didn't mean to say that. I didn't mean to say that with
Yeah,
the Spurs.
yeah. No, I'm just making a point. Michael Jordan, LeBron James, all these guys, they don't win a championship till they're 26, 27 years old, right? So Wembanyama is not the exception that he has to win tomorrow. Stop it, okay? Relax. Now he needs more functional players, but if you take Reed Shepard at number 4 and you put him next to Wemby And I think that elevates the floor of the Spurs. And then maybe in the next iteration, when they're trying to win a championship, that maybe he becomes a six man. Because for everything I've heard about him, he sounds like a great six man. I mean, a lightning shooter off the bench. That's exactly what you need, right? Could be a six man of the year perennial type of candidate. That's interesting. Um, but yeah, he's just an
But yeah,
interesting player in terms of the fact that he has like the best skill of anybody in the draft. I've heard it put like that, where he's going to knock the lights out of shooting. But again, he's just an interesting fit because he's under 6'2", and he's not a great playmaker. He's a two, like Ben's talking about. He's a two. So have a two under 6'2", your point guard's gonna have to you're gonna have to work around that and think about how you're gonna build around a player like that.
for sure. But yeah, for both the Spurs and the Hawks, we're not trying to win a championship this next season. We're trying to win a playoff series at maximum, like be out of the play-in tournament. That's what we're trying to do here. And that can keep Trae Young, and that's plenty on pace for the Spurs. Back to the Spurs, part of the other thing with this, instead of drafting a different guard, I want to see a veteran guard with Wembanyama. Like, yeah, is the timeline going to be perfect? No, it's not. But I think the best way to develop Wembanyama is to get him a guy who knows what he's doing and knows how to use a center and knows how to work with a big man and can train Wembanyama. Like, this is how we're doing it, right? If it's just two young guys just going out there, like, yeah, they're going to get better at basketball from playing in the NBA and they have Greg Popovich. But, like, I think the best way to do that is to have a vet, someone who's been around teaching him. And so, especially with there's no ceiling guards in this draft. So, from that perspective, I don't care. And then, but I do not want, like, ideally, I think a veteran would be better than a solid rookie guard with Wembanyama.
Yeah, so I was going to say that's the other route the Spurs could go is if they take Ricochet, which I think would also be a very good fit for them. Again, not a ceiling raiser, but Wembanyama's your ceiling raiser, right? You have that potential guy, right? So you need solid players next to him. If you take Ricochet and then you trade for a Darius Garland, now that's interesting, right? You got that veteran in quotes type of point guard. You got Ricochet, who's going to be that solid role player, shoot the ball, point of attack defense. You get Wembanyama at the five. Now that's starting to build an interesting core. I think I like that even a little bit more than the Reed Shepard. What do you
So
think
that's
about
what
that
I'm saying.
that type of fit?
That's exactly what I'm saying. That's a good fit. That's a much more traditional fit. In ways that makes a lot more sense. I'm playing GM from my couch. I don't have to worry about consequences. To me, I like in both the Hawks and the Spurs, like Ricochet fits in and it's a very good fit and it's very flexible and everything like that. To me, I like the ceiling that that level of shooting brings you, and I'll cover up the defense. I'll worry about the defense later. But I prefer the elite shooting over the average or above average shooting with good defense. I'd rather take this elite shooting skill and see what I can do with that. But yeah, it's the same play where the guard is this guy's going next to the guard and fitting with him. I think they both fit with the guard, and I'm choosing the elite shooting. But yeah, that path to me probably makes a lot more sense if you're going to get fired if it doesn't work. You know.
I think also just from a championship perspective, if you look at the recent champions, they don't have black holes defensively unless it's Steph Curry, right? Where
But
the
we're
guys
not
bring
winning a
so much
championship,
offensively.
Harry. Like we
Right. So
talked.
if you're not concerned about winning a championship, that's one thing. But again, I think if you're even for now and the future, I don't think the now is that much of an upgrade in terms of Reed Shepard at the two. And I'd much rather take Ricochet if I know I can trade for Darius Garland, take Ricochet. I think it's a much more traditional fit for now and for the future, right? Forget about winning a championship for now. Also, it just makes a lot more sense with Wemby, right? And again, I don't understand this concept of well, we're not trying to win a championship, so let's do something that doesn't make sense that we know we're gonna have to tear down later. Like, no, let's start building a team now because I want to get that continuity. If you look at the Boston Celtics who won the title this year, one of their main thing is they have continuity, or the Golden State Warriors who won 4 titles. They had continuity, right? So you want to start building something now. You don't want to draft somebody that you know this is not going to work long term for the championship, but I'll just do it for now and then we'll figure it out later. Like I don't see unless it's a crazy upside type of player where you're like, okay, let's just draft this guy and figure it out later. I don't see Reed Shepard. Obviously, he's elite shooting, but I don't see him to be that type of player where it's like, let's do something that doesn't really make that much sense and figure it out later.
Right. No, I think that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that about that completely. I hear what you're saying. This has turned into the most interesting debate that I've thought about in the draft is Reed Shepard versus Ricochet. And I think for the Spurs, what you're saying that's probably the way to go. Now that I'm like that point, I hear what you're saying. For the Hawks' perspective, the Hawks need as much ceiling as they can get to just get to the level of winning one playoff or two playoff series. So for them, it might be worth it, even if it's going to cap their ceiling. because they have the pressure of Trae Young's leaving. For the Spurs, you can just say continuity and just go with that, and that makes sense. But for the Hawks, I don't know if you the Hawks don't have time, and it's not a way to build a team, but they're in a tight spot. The Hawks.
Yeah, it's definitely a turning point, and we'll get to see what happens on draft night. Again, we only really talked about the Hawks and the Spurs so far, but again, I think that's really the interesting teams, like the Rockets at 3. I suppose they like Reed Shepard, so the interesting part would be like, could the Spurs potentially trade up to the Hawks? Because if the Hawks are set on Klingon, right? So I don't think the Wizards are going to take Klingon, and I don't think the Rockets are taking Klingon because they have Sengun, right? So if the Hawks like Klingon, it is interesting for them to let's trade down with the Spurs, even if they can't get that 8th pick alongside it, even if they can get a future pick. If you're taking Klingon, you may as well trade down, right? Because I don't think 2 or 3 is taking it. Now again, you risk another team trading up or something like that. But I think that's the main interesting thing about who's the Spurs going to take, who's the Hawks going to take, and there's a potential trade. Could the
With
Hawks
the
take Sarr to hold them hostage from the Wizards, things like that?
touching on the trade down, yeah, so if you're going down to 4, yeah, obviously you can't just be like we're getting Klingon at 4. You have to have other players that you're. It's a risk. Like you're saying, other teams could trade up and things like that. So you have to be open to other players if you're doing that. If they can get if they can trade down to 4, I mean, this is a crazy thing already. Trade down to 4, and what do you get back for that? If you can get back this year's first round pick back from the Spurs in exchange, and then you might want to blow it up, and get in the. There's 2 elite players this season. You only have to be top 2 to get Cooper Flag or Ace Bailey. So if you can do that, that might be the play, and it might allow you to just blow it up. Even if you're going to get undervalued package back for Trae Young, undervalued back for DeJounte, you can trade Bogey, you can trade Clint Capella. That might be a path to blow it up, even if they could just get 1 pick back.
Yeah, I just think that's too risky. Because first of all they won the lottery this year. Second of all, they lowered the odds for the top teams, right? So you could easily be the 5th pick, like the Pistons this year, right? Who were terrible, and they're the 5th pick. So I just don't. I'm not relying on getting a top 2 pick. And if you don't get a
It
top 2 pick,
depends.
then your whole plan is screwed. I wouldn't do something
It
like that.
depends. We don't know this from the outside. We're never going to know. It depends how in or out Trae Young is. What type of leash are we talking about? And he's a human being also. That thing changes. If you go through, that's what my vision. If they just Alex Sarr and he goes through the whole season of Alex Sarr being a garbage can trying to ISO, he might want to get traded real quick. Whatever. You got to know on the inside how in or out is Trae Young.
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna trade Trae Young, you gotta trade Trae Young. But to make a plan out of that, I don't love that idea. But again, if you don't care about who you take, right? You have them all at the same level, and the Spurs potentially make certain players make sense more than other players, and they might want to trade up. Like, what's the worst case scenario if if you go to 4, right? And Sarr, uh, whatchamacallit, Ricochet and Klingon go. So then you're stuck with Reed Shepard. Like, what's the worst case if you really don't
Reed
have a value
Shepard,
of one or the
Holland, Muzelis,
right? So it's like if you really don't have a high value, I think trading down to 4 is interesting, especially if you can get a future pick. Just because it's a draft preview, let's stick with the draft preview. We got to touch on Bronny. All right, I know you're not going to like it, but just throw it in because I think that's probably the third most interesting thing about this draft. Just because of his dad, obviously not because of him as a prospect. Nobody thinks he's good as a prospect. Rich Paul. By the way, you know what's funny? There was this Rich Paul interview, right? And they were talking to him, and he's like, yeah, if he's like Bronny's not automatically going to go or LeBron's not automatically going to go where Bronny goes, right? He's like, if we wanted Bronny, we would just force the Lakers to take Bronny. He slipped that in there. It slipped out after all this narrative. After all this narrative of like, oh, we don't actually control what happens. LeBron, when JJ Redick got announced as a coach today, me and LeBron never spoke at all. This guy let out the fattest groan in the back. Oh my gosh, what a legend. Anyhow, yeah, but
Bro, this
LeBron's
legend.
controlling what
Oh man.
happens. But the Bill Simmons thing is interesting. I want to touch on the Bill Simmons idea, which I think we talked about it briefly before. Um, is that a team like Boston? He was saying Boston with the 30th pick, right? What are you going to get with the 30th pick in this draft? Nothing, literally nothing, right? So is it worth to take Bronny, kind of hold him? He used the words hold him hostage. It's a little extreme, right? But take Bronny in hopes of some other team trading something more valuable than he actually is because it's Bronny, right? Do you think a team tries to do that, or you don't want to mess with Rich Paul, I guess, because he's a powerful agent in the NBA? Is there a potential of that happening, or do you just see chalk is going to happen, and the Lakers are going to take him at 55, and it's going to be yeah, pretty basic stuff.
Yeah, I mean, just to touch on Bronny the prospect, I haven't watched one play of his. I barely even know what he looks like. He's like 6'2" with like 6'7" arms, like which sounds just hilarious how long his arms are. I've heard things from Doug Gottlieb to calling this guy like a legitimate, barely D1. Doug Gottlieb said he would not start for his Wisconsin team, like as like a prospect. He would be on the team, but he wouldn't be in the top five. He doesn't think to
He
like
didn't start
legitimate
last
go
year for his team, and he wasn't playing for no Duke.
right. So there's that level, and then I've heard like this guy, could hang out in the G League and like actually be a useful player on a team. So I haven't heard complete. I think there's a little bit of a range, if he's actually a real prospect or not. In terms of the trade, to me, that a random team is going to trade you overvalued for him. That doesn't really make any sense to me. I've always been on the train of you draft him not to get LeBron to come to you, but to get LeBron to make the Lakers trade you something overvalued. I think the Lakers, there's a world where they do that, but I don't think any other team would do that.
Yeah, it's interesting because as of recently, it's kind of cooled down on like, oh, LeBron has to play with Bronny. Now they could just be doing that, to like lower the hype. But it doesn't seem like Bronny wants to play with LeBron. I haven't heard anything from him or any indication from him. It almost seems like he wants to get out from under his shadow. From just this is my personal view, no reporting or anything like that, right? And LeBron kind of cooled down on it. He's like, okay, if he doesn't really want to play with me, like it would be cool, but like it's not the end all be all, right? Um, Now, if LeBron at this point in his career just like doesn't care about winning a championship, he realized like, yeah, we're just not good enough to win with the Lakers. He's like, okay, so why am I continuing to play? Either I'm continuing to play to win a championship, or because I want to play with my son, right? So one or the other. So maybe in a year or two, he's like, okay, I'm ready to hang it up. Let me give it one more year just to play with Bronny. But it doesn't seem like the idea is as set in stone as it was, even a few months ago, where it's like, yeah, LeBron's going to go wherever Bronny does, and he needs to play with Bronny. It doesn't seem like that. Have you gotten those vibes too, or not really?
Yeah, that's the vibes. That's the vibes I've gotten. Um, Literally exactly as you said it. I do have one other prospect I want to touch on before we get out of here. Not right now, whenever it fits
No,
in.
go for it.
But
Go for it now. Go for it right now.
right now, so this guy's Dalton Connect. Um, I at some point got to a lot of my draft insight is basically watching Hoops Intellect videos. Dalton Connect is what people hope Risa Shea. Not even Dalton Connect is like the 110th percentile of Risa Shea on offense. Already a good shooter. Already consistent, proven. Well, not proven, but because whatever. Already a consistent movement shooter. Can create his own shot, not in a primary role in the NBA, but in a secondary role in the NBA. Um, Offensively, he is what people hope Reese Shea will be in 2 or 3 years. Now, is he 2 or 3 years older? Yes, he is, but he's ready to go right now. The issue with Connect is he's got good size, 6'6". Defense isn't great. Um, Partly because maybe he had a high usage. I don't know. Whatever. You got to be a real scout to actually try to parse that. He's probably a 3. Maybe you could play him at the 2. I've heard Bogdanovich comps, which kind of makes sense to me. Like any team who's relatively in win now mode, like get me that guy on my team. Like this guy's a bucket, especially as a win now team. He's going to be the third or fourth guy, probably the fourth guy. Like that's a really valuable player, even if he's a guy coming off the bench. Like he offensively, he seems like he's pretty ready to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main gap between him and Ricochet is Ricochet 6'10", right? So you do have that aspect of it. Now, that's not everything, but again, I think that's why Ricochet, if Dalton Connect was 6'10", maybe he's in that top five conversations.
But
But
he's not
how early?
six.
No, he's not 6'2", right? He is 6'6". He has good size, right? But because you like him so much, I'm just curious, how early would you take him in the draft? Would you consider him at number one with the Hawks, with the Rockets at number three, the Spurs, the Wizards? Like, how high are you taking him?
The Hawks, no, because I don't think no, not with the Hawks, not with the Wizards, because that just makes no sense. The Rockets also pretty rebuilding. No, 4. Who's 4? Oh, the Spurs.
Spurs.
Probably not. Timeline. Pistons also complete rebuild. Probably not. Who's 6?
I don't have six. Let me pull that up real quick.
I don't know.
Uh,
Maybe the Spurs at 8. Just because.
right, just like a good solid player to add to your rotation, someone's going to add value, basically.
Right. Right.
Because
Maybe the Spurs
six,
at 8.
I have it pulled up now. Six is Charlotte, rebuilding.
No.
Portland, rebuilding. Then you have San
I
Antonio,
don't hate it in Charlotte. They've got Lonzo and their 4, who I really like
Lamelo,
that guy,
Lamelo.
Lamelo. and the 4 who I really like from last year's draft. Plug this guy in 3 or the 2. Like he's a really good player. They need more buckets. He can get buckets. I don't hate it.
Looking at
There's not,
looking at the order, I think the other interesting one maybe is Memphis at 9 because they're not a rebuilding team. They're just Ja was out last year, and then the other one is Oklahoma City at 12.
yeah, either of those spots. And
Yeah,
they're
kind
going
of
to
like
be bench guys on those teams, which is great.
a kind of a ready to win now player, someone who could potentially be part of a playoff rotation this year. Obviously, there's different goals for different teams in the lottery, but again, at number 12, OKC is probably his floor. I would say. You never know. Sometimes these guys fall, and people don't really know, especially the draft experts. They're just kind of throwing stuff out there. But I think that's going to wrap things up for this podcast. I think that was a good preview. Again, we didn't go into depth of every single team, but I don't think people care. Like, do people care about who the Pistons are going to take? If you do, go listen to Locked On Pistons. You know what I'm saying? That wasn't like that I feel like that came off harsh. But my point is that wasn't the goal of this podcast. The point was kind of give an overview, especially number one, because I think number one is interesting. The Spurs are interesting. We got into some prospects. So I think that was a good overview. Um, don't forget to follow us on social media at the Agendas Pod on Twitter and YouTube. I might create a new TikTok soon. Um, so I'll keep you guys updated on that. And yeah, Ben, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I mean, yeah, like you're saying, like probably our best ability is we know the Hawks better than a lot of not better than any national host, just because we actually follow the Hawks. So this overview through a Hawks lens, like we're going to be better than a lot of people, and we can go into depth from that perspective.
All right. I think that's going to do it for us. Catch us on the next one. We're going to do an NBA free agency preview on the next one. Hopefully, come out in the next couple of days. And yeah, see you guys.